organising the SWF Fringe. So there we go, so we tick the box. So this evening, I'm very excited to introduce you to Terri Windling, who's here all the way from Devon. This is a very idyllic, beautiful part of the west of England. So she's come with me to very different climes to be part of the Singapore Writers Festival. My name is, just to get out of the way, my name is Jasmine and I'm going to be a moderator for this evening. So I want to tell you a little bit about Terri. I just want to know what have you read on the internet? No. So Terri is a person of very expansive expertise. She's a writer, she's an editor, she's a publicist, she is an artist, a visual artist. She's been practicing for many, many years. And with a specialism in fantasy, folklore and fairy tales. So she's going to be doing a talk for us today on folklore and fairy tales, which I'm very excited about. She's published and exhibited widely in the US and outside. And some of you might be familiar with her books, The Wood Wife, Good Fairies, Bad Fairies, and Changeling, among many more. When I searched you on the internet, I found this huge list of things that you have made, so it's really exciting things ahead of you here. I'm not going to do much more spiel. I think the time would be better used to introduce you. Can you please give a very warm welcome to Terri?
Is this on? Can you hear me? First of all, I want to say thanks to Arts House and to the sponsor, the Foundation, for having me all the way from England. It's just I've never been to Singapore before, I've never been to Asia before, and I'm just delighted to be here. It's one of the nicest festivals I think I've ever attended. So I just want to say thank you, and to all of you for coming out tonight when there were so many other things you could have been doing, and you're here. I really appreciate that. I'm going to give a little talk about fairy tales, the history of fairy tales in the West, and my personal relationship to fairy tale work. And afterwards, I'm going to have plenty of time for questions and anything that you all want to talk about. So I hope you'll contribute to that part of the evening. But I'm going to read this little talk. I hope you don't mind, but I'm a writer, not a performer. So I'm best off when I'm reading something I'm prepared as opposed to just talking out the top. So what is the very first story that you remember? Or the first to truly grab your heart? What stories entranced you as a child, or bewildered you, or frightened you? Each of us is shaped by these stories, formed by them, just as we're formed by our genes, our family, our upbringing, the culture and the times we live in. Our culture, too, is shaped by stories. The stories we learn, the stories we tell, the stories we collectively agree to believe in. Every day we're inundated by stories. On radio, television, the internet, film, in newspapers and magazines. Even advertising is based on a story, selling us ideas about who we are and what we need. Politics, too, where stories are spun to the raw fiber of unpalatable truth. History itself is a story told and retold, constantly reassessed. Our sacred laws, our texts, these are all stories, fluid and ever-changing. The illusion of permanence conjured by the written word and the printed page. I called it illusion because the words might not change, but the way that each generation reads these words changes. We even live our lives as stories, selecting and crafting our memories to give our past a plot structure and some semblance of meaning. And as we do so, we're influenced by all the stories around us. We're also influenced, often more than we know, by the stories we remember from childhood. So go back to the story that you loved most, or that affected you most when you were a kid, and you're likely to find that its theme echoes throughout your entire life's journey. It's a very strange phenomenon. And for many years, this has puzzled and intrigued me, why this should be so. What is it about these early stories, these magical tales and hero tales, that are beloved by children all over the world, that causes them to reverberate in our psyche for so many years after? What is it that keeps certain stories alive to be passed from generation to generation? Why, in our modern and rational world, do some of us still hunger for magic? for marvels, for dragons, for these things long after childhood has ended, while others reject the fantastic with an absolutism that borders on fear. What strange power do myths hold today? What do fairy tales have to tell us? I actually have no simple answer to these questions. I can only do what women have done in field and forest and fireside throughout human history. I'm going to tell you a story about stories, and it begins once upon a time. Once upon a time, there was a girl who was forced to flee her childhood home. Why? Let's never mind that now. Perhaps her parents were too poor to keep her. Perhaps her mother was an ogre or a witch. Perhaps her father had promised her to a troll, a tyrant, or a beast. She left home with the clothes on her back, and soon she was tired, hungry, and cold. As night fell, she took shelter in a desolate graveyard, thick with nettles and briars. Beyond the graves was a humpback hill, and in the side of that hill was a little door. The girl walked up to the door and saw a golden key standing in its lock. She turned the key, opened the door, and crossed over the threshold. I can still remember that moonlit night, but I don't remember how old I was, only that I was past the age when a girl should still believe in magic. Cold and quietly miserable in a childhood that seemed never-ending, I sat hunkered down in the grass among the gravestones of my grandfather's church, trying to conjure a portal to a magic realm by sheer force of will. Like many children, I longed to discover a door into fairy, a road to Oz, a wardrobe leading to Narnia, and I wanted to believe that if I wished it with all my strength and all my will, surely a door would open for me, surely they would let me in. I wanted to flee unhappiness, yes, but there was more to my desire than this, more than just escape from the intolerability of the here and now. My desire was also a spiritual one, for we forget that spiritual quest is a common and natural part of childhood, as young people struggle to understand how they fit into the world around them. That night, my solemn conviction was I did not fit into the world I knew, and so I sought to cross into some other world through the power of imagination. Did I really think it would be possible? To tell you the truth, I don't even know. But my longing for that place was real. My sharp, physical, almost painful desire for things I imagined lay just beyond that door. Vast, unmapped, unspoiled forests, rivers that were clean and safe to drink, wolves and bears who would guide my way once I'd learned the power of their speech. My childhood in the ordinary world was a transient and uprooted one. But beyond that door, I would find my place, my power, and my true home. Like many children hungry for intimate connection with the spirit-filled unknown, what I failed to manifest that night, I found in my favorite children's books, in fairy tales, myths, and other tales of border crossing and enchantment. I read these stories over and over again. I devoured them, and I needed them. But there came a time when I understood I was growing too old for fairy stories, and I slipped them back to the back of the shelves, embarrassed by my attachment to them. I was dutiful. I read realistic books about teen detectives, inventors, and spies. I read teen romances and girl-with-horse novels. I watched the wholesome Brady Bunch and Partridge Family on television, and I'm dating myself here. And nowhere in the popular culture of the 60s did I see a life or a family that was remotely like mine. Secretly, I still preferred those fairy stories that I was meant to outgrow. I found a strange kind of comfort in them, though I couldn't have told you why. I would have been reassured had someone told me then that fairy stories weren't originally for children at all. I wouldn't have felt so obliged to hide them in the back of the shelf. For thousands of years, folk and fairy tales have been enjoyed by listeners, young and old alike. And the earliest publications of fairy tales were aimed at adult readers. Francesco Straparola's The Delectable Nights and Giambattista Basile's The Tale of Tales, published in 15th and 16th century Italy, were sensual, bawdy, unflinchingly violent, and morally complex. Straparola, in fact, had to defend his edition against charges of indecency from from the Venetian Inquisition. The story is also different from their modern counterparts by containing a wider range of women's roles than we're used to finding in fairy tales today. In the oldest tales, heroines come in a range of types and temperaments. Some are hapless, silly creatures, but others are brave, clever, even devious. They're not docile princesses waiting for rescue, as they too often became from Victorian times onward. Cinderella, for example, didn't sit weeping in the cinders, waiting for talking bluebirds fluttering around her and a fairy godmother to rescue her. She was a clever, feisty, and very angry young girl who worked to achieve her own salvation with the help of advice from her dead mother's ghost, not the twinkle of fairy magic. In older versions of the Bluebeard narrative, which I believe people are watching tonight, the young bride does not sit trembling, waiting for her brothers to rescue her. She outwits her captor, kills him, and restores the lives of her murdered predecessors. The story of Little Red Riding Hood provides a good example for how fairy tales have been altered through the centuries. Originally called the grandmother's story in Europe, it's rooted in older tales from Asia, largely from China, but it was largely shaped in the West by the rural traditions of France from the Middle Ages onward. The heroine of the grandmother's tale does not wear the famous red cap or hooded cloak, which was a detail added in the 17th century version by Charles Perrault. Nor does she require rescue by a passing hunter, which was added in the 19th century by the Brothers Grimm. Little Red Riding Hood, as we know it today, is a cautionary tale warning little girls of the perils of disobedience. But the older story is a complex one of female initiation and maturation. It comes in a variety of forms, but in general the story goes like this. A woman had finished her baking, so she asked her daughter to take a fresh galette and a pot of cream to her grandmother, who lived in a forest cottage. The girl set off on her way, and she met a Bizou, which is a werewolf. The Bizou stopped the girl and said, "Where are you going? What do you carry?" "I'm going to my grandmother's house," said the girl, "and I'm bringing her bread and cream." "What path will you take?" said the Bizou. "The path of needles or the path of pins?" "Why, I'll take the path of pins," said the girl. "Then I'll take the path of needles, and we'll see who gets there first." The girl set off, and the Bizou set off. And the Bizou reached grandmother's cottage first. He quickly killed the old woman and gobbled her up, flesh, blood, and bone, except for a bit of flesh, which he put in a little dish on the pantry shelf, except for a little bit of blood, which he drained into a little bottle. Then the Bizou dressed up in grandmother's cap and shawl and climbed into bed. When the girl arrived, the Bizou called out, "Pull the peg and come in, my child." "Grandmother," said the girl, "mother sent me here with a galette and cream." "Put them in the pantry, child. Are you hungry?" "Yes, I am, grandmother." "Then cook the meat you'll find on the pantry shelf. Are you thirsty?" "Yes, I am, grandmother." "Then drink the wine you'll find on the pantry shelf beside it, child." As the girl cooked and ate the meat, a little cat piped up and cried, "You're eating the flesh of your grandmother." "Throw your shoe at that noisy cat," said the Bizou, and so she did. As she drank the wine, a small bird cried out, "You're drinking the blood of your grandmother." "Throw your shoe at that noisy bird," said the Bizou, and so she did. When she finished her meal, the Bizou said, "Are you tired from your journey, child? Then take off your clothes, come into bed, and I shall warm you up." "But where shall I put my apron, grandmother?" "Throw it in the fire, child, for you won't need it anymore." "Where shall I put my bodice, grandmother?" "Throw it in the fire, you won't need that either." The girl repeats this question for her skirt, her petticoat, her stockings, and the Bizou gives the same answer every time. She throws each item onto the fire and comes to bed saying, "Grandmother, how hairy you are. The better to keep you warm, my child. Grandmother, what big arms you have. The better to hold you close, my child. Grandmother, what big ears you have. The better to hear you with, my child. Grandmother, what sharp teeth you have. The better to eat you with, my child. Come and lie beside me. But first I must go out and relieve myself. Do it in the bed, child." "I cannot. I must go out," the girl says, for by now she knows it's a Bizou who is lying in grandmother's bed. Then go outside, the Bazoo agrees, but mind you come back again quick. I'll tie your ankle with a woolen thread, so I'll know just where you are. He ties her ankle with a sturdy thread, but as soon as the girl has gone outside, she cuts the thread with her sewing scissors and ties it to a plum tree. The Bazoo, growing impatient, calls out, "What, have you finished yet, child?" When no one answers, he calls again, "Are you watering the grass? Are you feeding the trees?" No answer. He leaps from the bed, follows the thread, and finds her gone. The Bazoo gives chase, and soon the girl can hear him on the path just behind her. She runs and she runs till she reaches a river that's swift and deep. Some laundresses are at work on the riverbank. "Please help me cross," she says. "A Bazoo is behind me." They spread a sheet over the water, holding tightly to its ends. She crosses the bridge of cloth, and soon she's safe on the other side. Now the Bazoo reaches the river, and he too bids the women to help him cross. They obligingly spread the sheet over the water, but as soon as the wolf is halfway across, the clever old women let it go. The Bazoo falls in the water and drowns, and the girl makes it safely home. Now, numerous variants of this tale were collected by French and Italian folklorists in the 19th and 20th century. And although the details change from story to story, the basic element of the plot remains consistent. The cannibal meal, the toilet ruse, the heroine who plots her own escape. All elements that would disappear once the tale moved from oral transmission into print. In the oral tales, the girl must choose between two paths, paths of needles and path of pins. In some versions, she chooses pins. In other versions, she chooses needles. And in a few versions, the Bazoo chooses for her. Now, sewing and spinning terms are ones we find often in fairy tales, for the making of clothes and cloth was a constant part of rural women's labor prior to the 20th century. Such work was often done communally, in spinning rooms and around an evening fire, and when gossip was shared and tales were told to relieve the monotony of the task at hand. It's small wonder that the needles, pins, distaffs, spindles, and other symbols of women's work often appear in folk tales told largely by female storytellers, and some folklorists attach no more significance to the two paths than this. Yvonne Verdier, however, disagreed in an essay on the subject that she published in France in 1995. Verdier had extensively recorded and studied the folklore, tradition, and rituals of rural women in remote areas of France, and she brought her wider understanding of traditional women's stories to her examination of this tale. In the villages she studied, she found that girls were sent at puberty to spend one winter with the local seamstress, a passage of time that marked a girl's change from child to young woman. Writing about these villages, she noted, this wasn't just to do with learning to sew, but also a girl was learning to refine herself, redefining herself as a young woman rather than a child. It was a kind of finishing school for these country girls, and a local seamstress expressed this by saying of her young apprentices, they had been gathering pins. At the age of 15, after their winter with a seamstress, the girls could now be considered eligible for suitors in marriage. Pins were a symbol of this transformation. The young woman threw pins into the wells and fountains as a ritual means to summons a sweetheart, and young men paid court by offering pins as a token of their affection. As for the needles, however, Verdier pointed out, and I'm quoting her now, the thread poked through its eye. In the folklore of the seamstresses, it referred to an emphatically sexual symbolism. In the mountain villages of France and other parts of Europe, prostitutes once wore needles on their sleeves to advertise their profession. Thus, the versions of the grandmother's tale where the girl chooses the path of needles well imply that the heroine was trying to grow up a little bit too quickly. At the end of the story, the werewolf awaits, disguised as the heroine's grandmother. We assume he's wearing his human shape now, which makes the deception a bit more convincing, and yet it's odd that the granddaughter can't tell the difference right away. The English fairy tale scholar Marina Warner suggests that it's because there's a similarity between the wolf and the crone. The grandmother lives in the forest, an unusual place for a helpless old woman, but a common place for a wise woman, for a witch, an herbalist, and other femmes sauvages. Warner writes, in the witch-hunting fantasies of early modern Europe, wolf and crone are a kind of beings associated with marginal knowledge, who possess pagan secrets and are in turn possessed by them. Now, we're not surprised when the zoo slaughters grandmother. That is, after all, what werewolves do. But the granddaughter's gruesome meal is shocking, particularly in the Italian version of the tale, where it's lovingly described how it's cooked and prepared. Verdi likens this ritual meal to a sacrificial act, a physical incorporation of the grandmother by her granddaughter. Such a scene is reminiscent of a very wide variety of European myths in which a warrior, shaman, sorcerer, or witch attains another's knowledge or power through ritual ingestion of body organs. But Verdi looks at this part of the story in more symbolic terms. What the tale is telling us, the scholar says, is the necessity of female biological transformation, by which the young replace the old in their lifetimes. Mother will be replaced by the daughter, the circle will be closed with the arrival of the children's children. The slow striptease, then demanded by the wolf, hints of a completely different type of appetite, as does the fact that the zoo is not just a wolf, but also a man. Though focusing on those aspects of the tale that speak the language of female initiation, Verdi also acknowledges the powerful role of the wolf at the center of the story. He's more than just a symbol of the dangers of sexual deception. He's the agent of change. He stands at the crossroads when she chooses the pins. He's the origin of the choice. It's when she's face to face with him, under his gaze, and at his demand, that she incorporates her grandmother and dresses, which is to say, he leads the game. He leads, but he doesn't win. For in the folktale, she's not eaten by the wolf. She sees through his tricks at last, takes his measure, and shrewdly escapes him. The werewolf is finally destroyed, not by a passing woodsman or a hunter, but by a group of women engaged in traditional women's labor. This double role, held by the laundresses, on the one hand allowing the girl to pass, thereby rescuing her, on the other hand drowning the wolf and killing him, is consistent, Verdier points out, with traditional women's roles in the villages, where the job in insisting in passages of helping childbirth and also helping people to die was usually held by one and the same person, an aged woman, a laundress, a woman who at the same time handled the swaddling and the shroud, who washes the infants as she washes the dead. So in the story, if the laundresses bring about the death of the wolf, they also bring about the rebirth of the girl. Looking at the grandmother's tale within the context of rural and French and Italian history, we should also remember that the story comes from a time when wolves were a real danger in the countryside, and when people of all classes still believed in the existence of werewolves. As German folklorist Marion Rumpf has documented, France was positively rife with werewolf trials in the 15th to 17th centuries, a masculine counterpart to the witch hysteria of the time. She points out that the regions of France where folklorists found the grandmother's tale most widespread were also the regions where werewolf trials had been most widespread. So there's definitely a connection there. Now, by the end of the 17th century, when the French fairy tale writer Charles Perrault wrote and published his well-known version of Little Red Riding Hood, popular belief in werewolves have dwindled, at least among the upper classes. Educated people generally disdained the backwards folklore of the countryside. But that was about to change due to the labors of a group of writers living in Paris. Congregated in literary salons run by Madame Delmoy and other outspoken women, these writers created an entire popular genre of magical tales for adult readers, for which they coined a brand new name, contes de fées, or fairy tales, from which we get the term today. These were adult tales. The salon writers drew inspiration from peasant tales of magic and enchantment, but they reworked this material, dressing it up in Rococo language and aristocratic clothes, penning stories that commented on contemporary life at the court of Louis XIV. These tales proved to be so popular that they were eventually collected in 41 volumes called the Cabinet de Fées, which were reprinted and translated in small editions all throughout Europe. Although the majority of these French salon tales were written by women writers, Charles Perrault is the writer who is from the period whose tales are best known to us today. Like his colleagues, Perrault used themes and characters drawn from peasant tales, turning them into droll little stories for adult readers of the upper classes. But unlike many of his salon colleagues, however, who often encoded distinctly feminist subtext into their fairy stories, Perrault maintained traditional ideas about the role of women, and his tales demonstrated the correct behavior expected of women of his class. His heroines are uniformly beautiful, whereas we know nothing of the appearance of the granddaughter in the grandmother's tale. And they tend to be hapless creatures, either passive saints or active fools. Now, the heroine of his Little Red Riding Hood is a pretty naive little girl, doted on by her mother and her grandmother. Perrault gives her a red chaperon to wear, a fashionable little hat, not a hood, that was generally made out of velvet or satin. Red would have been an unusually flamboyant color choice for an unmarried girl. More modest attire, the text implies, would not have attracted the attention of a wolf. But attract him she does, and worse, she stops to talk to him. Not knowing any better, as the text tells us. She tells him where grandmother lives, whereupon he suggests a race to the house. He runs, while she foolishly dawdles, amusing herself with butterflies and flowers. Here again, the text implies that the heroine's fate is her own blessed fall. Perrault eliminates the cannibal meal. He eliminates the girl's striptease, merely telling us that the girl undresses and climbs into bed beside the wolf. When she says, "Grandmother, what big teeth you have," the wolf gives his well-known reply, "All the better to gobble you up." And then he pounces, eats her up, and the story ends. The end. Perrault finishes with a moral, making the point of his story crystal clear. Now, he says, there are real wolves with hair pelts and enormous teeth, but also wolves who seem perfectly charming, sweet-natured and obliging, who pursue young girls in the streets and pay them the most flattering attention. Unfortunately, these smooth-tongued, smooth-pelted wolves are the most dangerous of all. So once again, let's look at this tale within the historical context, for it was published by Perrault in 1796 for a very particular audience, and aristocratic readers in the court of Louis XIV. The Sun King's court was famed for its wealth, its intrigues, its sexual excesses, particularly as practiced in the king's sumptuous playground at Versailles. At the same time, virginity in young brides was absolutely insisted upon. For marriage was a business arrangement contracted between two upper-class families, and a girl's market value decreased sharply if her virginity was compromised. Perrault's story addresses the subject of seduction and rape, but not rape as we understand it today, rape as it was legally defined in Perrault's day. Fathers had an absolute legal right to determine whom their daughters would marry, and a man who seduced or married a young woman without her father's consent was guilty of rape, regardless of the wishes of the woman in question. Now, to avoid this occurrence, daughters were often kept locked up in convents until they were married in order to avoid romances and entanglements and elopements. Perrault's own wife had been raised in this fashion, locked up in a convent and emerging shortly before their marriage. Perrault laid eyes on her only once before the wedding. At the same time, certain women were agitating for greater freedom for their sex, particularly the influential women who were running the Parisian salons. Within the salons, men and women, and these were in Paris primarily, men and women could mix more casually than was possible at court. They could converse about art and politics and meet on more equal terms. Perrault himself was a frequenter of the salons, one of the most famous run by his own niece. And as an academician, he championed modern French culture, which was generally more favorable to women. But in his tales, he consistently stripped folk heroines of the power of self-determination, holding up modesty and demure good manners as the feminine ideal. By lacking these things, Red Riding Hood walks blindly into the jaws of the wolf, and her fate is as merciless as that of girls seduced by wolves in human skin. The wolves are only doing what comes naturally. It's female behavior under scrutiny here. As contemporary American scholar Catherine Lawrenson notes in her rather entertaining book, Little Red Riding Hood Uncloaked, Perrault's warning is not simply to girls in the woods, but to the well-educated, well-bred women of the Paris salons who, in inviting men and women together in mixed company, set a dangerous precedent. Little Red Riding Hood was a popular tale, in Perrault's version, and it soon spread beyond the borders of France. As it became well known, elements from Perrault's stories, such as the Red Chaperon and the Foolish Heroine, slipped into the oral tradition just as though they'd always been there. When the Brothers Grimm published their version of the story, Little Red Cap, 100 years later, they convincingly proclaimed it as part of the oral tradition of Germany. Contrary to public perception, however, the stories published by the Grimms in their famous collection of German folktales did not all come straight from the mouths of stout German peasants. They mostly came from the Grimms' circle of middle-class friends who had heard them from nursemaids and governesses, many of whom were French or Italian, and whose retellings bore the influence of the literary tales of those countries. The Grimms then edited and even rewrote the stories prior to their publication, inculcating them with their own 19th century moral, German Protestant moral values. With each new edition of fairy tales that they collected, they altered their stories more and more as they realized that children and their parents were the primary buyers of their collections rather than the scholars they had originally intended them for. Now the Grimms begin their version of Little Red Cap with clear instructions from the girl's mother to stay safely on the path, which subtly shifts the emphasis of the story to the girl's disobedience. Whereas Perrault had warned girls to be modest and chaste, lest they be gobbled up by the wolf, the Grimms warned them to mind the rules and stay on the straight and narrow. They also changed the ending, adding a hunter who comes to save the day. He cuts the wolf's belly open, and out steps grandmother and Little Red Cap, good as new. The wolf's belly is then filled with stones, which causes him to fall down dead. Just in case we don't get the point, there's a second ending appended to the Grimm's retelling in which Little Red Cap encounters a second wolf, but this time she's a good little girl. She stays on the path and reaches her grandmother's house in safety. Little Red Riding Hood became popular in the English language in the middle of the 19th century when the fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm took Victorian England by storm. The Red Cap then became a red cloak and hood like those worn by English country women at the time. And it's in this guise that the heroine of the tale has been known to us English language readers ever since. Advances in printing methods led in the 19th century to the rise of the children's book industry, and Victorian editors, following in the footsteps of the Grimms, continued altering fairy tales to make them suitable for younger and younger children. Some publishers found even the Grimm's editions too scary, too harsh, and soon there were versions of Little Red Riding Hood in which the huntsman comes to the rescue before the wolf eats up grandmother and Little Red Riding Hood. Since we now think of fairy tales as children's stories, one of the most surprising things about the older versions of the tale is just how immoral they can be. Not immoral, but amoral. For even as adult fictions, we tend to seek moral meanings and teachings in them, when in fact, sometimes their purpose was simply to reflect the world as it was, warts and all. Let's look at another unfamiliar version of a well-known tale, Snow White. For most people today, the name Snow White evokes visions of dwarves whistling as they work, and wide-eyed, fluttery princess singing, "Someday my prince will come." A friend of mine claims this song is responsible for the problems of a whole generation of American women. Yet the Snow White theme is one of the darkest and strangest to be found in the fairy tale canon, at least before the Brothers Grimm and Walt Disney got hold of it. There are a number of different versions of the tale, but the one I'm going to tell you is one of the oldest and comes from 16th century Naples. A kind-hearted queen gave birth to a baby girl and then died, to the king's despair. The child, who had never known her mother, grew up happily enough, basking in her father's affection, until the time came when the king decided that his daughter must have a companion. He hired a beautiful young woman to be his daughter's governess, and for a while all seemed to be well, and the princess adored her new companion. The governess, having won the girl's heart, persuaded the princess to help her in capturing the heart of the king as well. But soon the princess discovered that her new stepmother was not as she had been. Where the governess had been warm and soft, the queen was cold and hard. Where the governess had been selfless and modest, the queen was proud and vain. In short, now that she'd gotten what she wanted, the queen no longer needed her stepdaughter's love. And she soon forgot all about the girl as she busied herself with balls and gowns and spending her new husband's wealth. Once the princess reached puberty, however, she drew the queen's attention once more, for the girl was becoming beautiful, and the queen didn't like what she saw. This fresh budding lily makes all other women look wrinkled and dried out as crones beside her. How shall I compete with this? I have only my beauty to hold my husband, only my beauty to give me rank. But beauty fades, and it fades faster still when youthful loveliness enters the room. I must send her away. Or better still, I must rid myself of her for good. The clever queen hired a witch to help her solve the problem. The witch, disguised as a peddler, approached the princess with sweetmeats for sale. The princess bought a sweetmeat from the old woman, ate it, and fell down dead. For the food had been laced with poison on instructions from the queen. Alas for the queen, however, the local fairies took note and revived the girl, for the old queen, the princess's mother, had done them a kindness in the past. The new queen sat and brooded, and soon she came up with another plan. This time, the witch arrived at the princess's door with golden combs to sell. The combs, too, were poisoned, and as soon as they touched the girl's hair, she fell down dead. Once again, the fairies revived the princess, instructing the young woman to be more wary and careful in the future. But when the witch came knocking on the princess's door one more time, this time as a traveling tailoress, the girl could not resist trying on a beautiful gown as dark as the night, stitched with pearls as white as the moon, scattered with diamonds as bright as the stars. The dress had poisoned laces, however, and as the witch tightly laced it up, the princess fell down dead, cold and white as snow. This time, the fairies would not revive her, for they were peeved that the girl had ignored their warning. Instead, they placed the princess's body into a glass casket encrusted with gems. They rode the casket to the back of a horse and sent it off to a foreign city. Now the prince of that city, taking the air, discovered the horse with a strange cargo on its back. He loosened the ropes, lowered the casket, and gazed on the princess within. He promptly fell in love with this beautiful doll and took it home with him, where his mother, the queen, gazed at this new treasure with alarm. "But my son, that girl is dead," she said. But the prince would not be parted with his new treasure. He locked himself away in the tower, consumed, the story tells us, with love. What on earth was he doing? Soon after, he was called away to battle, leaving the beautiful doll in the care of his mother. In the days and weeks to follow, the queen determined to ignore the macabre creature until a letter arrived warning her of her son's impending return. Quickly, she called for her chambermaids and commanded them to clean the neglected corpse. As they did so, they spilled water in their haste, badly staining the maiden's dress. The queen thought quickly, "Take off the dress. We'll have another one made, and my son will never know." The chambermaids complied, but as they loosened the laces, the girl returned to life. She sat up in the casket, confused and alarmed, as she would be. The queen heard her story with sympathy, dressed the girl in her own royal clothes, and then hid the girl behind lock and key. As the prince arrived home, he immediately asked to see the doll, who he now referred to as his wife. "My son," said the queen, "that girl was dead. She smelled so badly we buried her." The prince raged and wept, and the queen relented. "My son, here is your doll," she said, "returned to life and as good as new." The girl was summoned, her story told, and the two were now wed in earnest. Which is very different from the Disney version that many of us grew up with. Now the Grimm's version starts, like so many fairy stories, with a barren queen who longs for a child. You know, it's a winter tale in this northern clime, set in a landscape of vast icy forest. The queen stands sewing by an open window. She pricks her finger. Blood falls on the snow. "Would that I had a child," she sighs, "as white as the snow, as red as blood, as black as the wood of this ebony window frame." Her wish is granted, but the gentle queen expires as soon as the baby is born. Or so most readers now believe. Yet the death of the queen, the good mother, was a plot twist introduced by the Grimms. In the earliest version of the tale, the manuscript of 1810 and the first edition of published edition of 1812, it's Snow White's natural mother whose jealousy takes a murderous bent. They turn her into an evil stepmother in editions from 1819 onward. Whether mother or stepmother, the murderous queen remains one of the most vivid villains in folkloric history. She orders the death of the girl, demands her heart, and then eats it boiled for supper. Snow White's father, the king, is notable only by his absence, his apparent indifference, and his failure to protect his only child. Yet, as Angela Carter once pointed out about another neglectful father, Cinderella's father, the king in Snow White, too, is the unmoved mover, the unseen organizing principle. Without the absent father, there would have been no story because there would have been no conflict. Now, in most older versions, when the girl runs to the forest, she's taken in by bandits or brigands, not dwarves. But the Grimms not only avoided the impropriety of an unmarried girl living with all these rough men, but she also earns her keep with her virtuous housekeeping skills. When Walt Disney took up the tale for his animated feature in 1932, he too made a fetish of this royal maiden's unlikely talent for scrubbing and sweeping. Disney was fond of fairy tales, but he was not any more shy than the Grimms of reshaping them to suit his needs, turning them into the simple comedic tales he believed his audiences wanted, a generation marked by economic depression and a world war. He emphasized the dwarves, giving them names, distinct personalities, and a cozy cottage in a sun-dappled wood of bluebirds and bunnies and flowers, not snow. And the role of the prince was greatly expanded. The square-jawed fellow now becomes pivotal to the story. His love for Snow White, demonstrated at the very beginning of the Disney film, becomes the spark that sets off the powder keg of the stepmother's rage. Whereas in the old folktale, he doesn't meet Snow White until she's in her casket. In Disney's singing, dancing, whistling version of the story, only the queen retains some of the real power of the old traditional tale. She's a genuinely frightening figure, and far more compelling than Little Snow White, despite early notes in the making of the film in which it suggested that the queen should be a vain, batty, self-satisfied comedy type, and verging on the ridiculous. Snow White, who was drawn as a blonde at one point, is wide-eyed, giddy, and childish, wearing rags, Cinderella style, at the start of the film, downtrodden but plucky. This gives Disney's rendition of the tale its peculiarly American flavor, implying that what we're watching is a rags to riches story, when in fact it's a story of riches to rags to riches, in which privilege is lost and then restored. Snow White's pedigree, beauty, and class origins assure her salvation, not her housekeeping skills. Although the film was a commercial triumph and has been beloved by generations of children, critics through the years have protested the sweeping changes that Disney Studios made and continues to make when retelling fairy tales. Walt himself responded, "It's just that people don't want fairy stories the way they were written. They're just too rough. In the end, they'll probably remember the story the way we film it." Regrettably, time has proved him right. Disney's fairy tales and all the imitated children's books they've spawned went a long way to foster the modern misconception that fairy tales are only for children and have always only been for children. And yet, fairy tales, as J.R.R. Tolkien pointed out in a very famous lecture on fairy stories given in 1938, have no particular historical association with children. They've been pushed into the nurseries as like furniture the adults no longer want and no longer care if it's misused. Fairy stories, he said, banished in this way, cut off from a full adult art, will be ruined. In fact, insofar as they have been so banished, they have been ruined. Now, it was Tolkien himself who was largely responsible for bringing magical tales back to an adult audience, which he did, of course, through the international success of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien's books surprised many critics by striking a chord with readers of all ages and from all walks of life, directly challenging the assumption that fantasy had no place on the adult bookshelves. Now today, a generation of readers who have grown up with Bilbo and Frodo Baggins, not to mention Sparrowhawk, Harry Potter, Lara Bellicott, and a whole modern fantasy publishing industry, may not fully comprehend the absolute boundary-busting nature of J.R.R. Tolkien's achievement. In the place and time I grew up, for example, in the 1960s, there were only a very few fantasy books available in the local library. The Narnia books, the Alice books, Wind in the Willows, a handful of others. Strictly confined to the children's section, and somewhat suspect even there. Fantasy, I was given to understand, was like the training wheels on my first two-wheel bike. A forgivable crutch at the outset when you're beginning to read, but when you're meant to progress beyond needing. But I hadn't progressed. I still craved such tales, even though they stood on shelves meant for much younger children. A worried librarian actually took the blue fairy book out of my checkout stack, replacing it with a more age-appropriate book about an insipid, perky camp counselor. The message was clear. Fantasy belonged to children who still played with dress-up dolls, and my craving for it led me to think there was something wrong with me. It was only later that I learned that others shared this craving too, including adults. Tolkien wrote, "I desired dragons with a profound desire," speaking of his own adolescence. Of course, I and my timid body did not wish to have them in the neighborhood, he said, but the world that contained even the imagination of Fafnir was richer and more beautiful, at whatever cost and peril. Now, it wasn't until I turned 14 that I discovered Tolkien's trilogy, although the books had been available in American edition for some years before that. I remember beginning the Fellowship of the Ring on a school bus on a gray winter morning, reading with pure amazement as Middle-earth opened up before me. Here, in the language of fantasy, was a story that seemed more real to me than any realistic story I'd ever read. A story about danger, terror, and courage, about the cost of heroism, the importance of moral choices. In Middle-earth, as in my parents' home, an epic battle between good and evil was waging, and even a humble, seemingly powerless creature like a hobbit could affect its outcome. Several months after The Lord of the Rings, I discovered Tolkien's slim volume, Leaf by Nigel, containing his lecture and essay on fairy stories, which was actually for me a more influential text than all the good profession celebrated fiction. It was here I first learned that fairy tales had an old and noble lineage, and that they'd once been so much more than the Disney versions I'd grown up with. I dug out my favorite fairy tale books, and I read the old tales then with new eyes, and this time, I understood why I clung to these stories for all those years. Like Tolkien's books, they address large subjects: good and evil, cowardice and courage, hope and despair, peril and salvation. All subjects not unfamiliar to children from embattled households. Fairy tales spoke in their metaphorical language of danger, struggle, calamity, but also of healing journeys, self-transformation, deliverance, and grace. They are stories of children abandoned in the wolves, of daughters poisoned at their own mother's hands, of sons forced to betray their siblings, of young men and women struck down by wolves or imprisoned in windowless towers. The fairy tales that I loved the best were variations on one archetypal theme. A young person beset with grave difficulties sets off alone through the deep dark woods. Armed with quick wits, clear sight, persistence, courage, compassion, and a dollop of luck, they meet every challenge, solve every riddle, and transform themselves in their fate. This was my story, my myth, the central text and theme of my own life's journey. This was the story I needed to hear again and again and again. It wasn't long after I read Tolkien's essay and renewed my acquaintance with fairy tales that my own life journey reached the inevitable crisis of one of these archetypal stories. The precise nature of the calamity doesn't matter. What's important here is that it put me on the road. It propelled me out onto the quest of my life, forced me into the role of a plucky young hero traveling toward adulthood. Living on the streets in a different city as a runaway with my worldly possessions fit into one small sack: 2 shirts, some jeans, a travel-stained sleeping bag, a sketchbook, and my favorite collection of fairy tales, which I've carried with me through all the years since. Like the heroes of those tales, I discovered I had a gift for making true friendship. As I traveled through the deep dark woods, I learned that no kindness, however small, was unrewarded. I learned to distinguish friend from foe. I met helpers along the road, animal guides, and fairies cloaked in the most unlikely disguises. A year later, by a magic as strange and powerful as any elven enchantment, I found myself in the safe harbor of a small Midwestern university. It was there that I studied the history of myths and fairy tales that I'd so long loved. And even better, discovered a rising new publishing genre called fantasy fiction for adult readers. Now I'm going to end the tale here for the story of my youth, reaching those university halls. That was my act of triumph, of self-transformation, my version of living happily ever after. childhood and all my subsequent life adventures, well, those are tales for another tale. But to live happily ever after doesn't mean achieving a life free of pain or sorrow or struggle, but one that partakes of what Professor Tolkien required in fairy stories ending, what he called the consolation of joy and a miraculous grace. Through fairy tales, myth, and fantasy, I finally found what I long sought, a key to that door in the hill. Stepping through, I entered the dragon haunted lands where I've traveled ever since, as a writer, as an editor, as an artist, wandering through its vast forests, drinking from its clear streams, and learning to speak with the wolves and bears, which, as it turns out, isn't as hard as you think. I sometimes wish I could travel through time and step back to that old graveyard where my younger self sat miserable, longing for magic. That is to say, longing for hope. This is what I whisper in her ear. Have faith, child. You're not crazy at all. There are better worlds out there, and you're going to find them, I promise. So let me end now by asking all of you, what's your favorite fairy tale, or myth, or storybook? What did you love when you were small? And can you see the ways in which it resonates through your life today? Tell me your story. I'll tell you mine, and together we'll conjure a door in the hill. Beyond it, we'll find fantasy worlds where dragons fly and animals speak, where heroes prevail and children are safe, and doors open when